Welcome to This Just In with This Just In as your host, Justin Core. This is a show where we take a deeper dive into the stories most important to you with the people who bring you those stories. And our story today, a heavy one, but our correspondent, nobody better to talk about this with and get us through this difficult, heavy, but important episode. Main anchor and investigative reporter Morgan Romero. Morgan, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And today, we're going to get right to our topic, the upcoming sentencing for Bryan Kohberger. What's going to happen? We're going to hear reaction from the victims' families, as much as we've heard. And this story, the murder of those four young University of Idaho students just starting their lives, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, one that you've been on since it broke in November of 2022 now. It's been a while. And when we heard just a couple of weeks ago that Kohberger might have a plea deal just a few weeks before jury selection, we thought was going to start for the trial. Were you surprised?
Very surprised. You know, they had years to get to this point, and so much discovery was shared. They'd had so many hearings, so many opportunities. But then when you really break it down and you realize all the efforts the defense made in the last several months, like trying to get the death penalty taken off the table, trying to get that alibi introduced that the judge essentially said is not an alibi, trying to get the alternate perpetrators theory introduced, naming people that they accused of potentially being involved in these murders, and the judge striking that down too. So really a lot of losses for the defense team. They did everything they could. And ultimately, you know, my understanding is, you know, it's a discussion between the defense and the prosecution. And so potentially they could have approached the prosecution and said, listen, can we work something out? But the prosecution is the one that has to offer that up. And so I think that was what was surprising to me, was that the prosecution would offer this to the defense and say, all right, we can work something out to get the death penalty off the table in exchange for him admitting to these four murders, in exchange for no appeals. He gets life in prison without the chance of parole, and potentially these families don't have to endure months of trial.
And so you can understand the appeal to maybe some of the families, and we'll talk about their reaction to all this in a bit. Let's go through the details, though, of that plea deal again, and sort of what it means, and what, even if he potentially was found guilty and sentenced to death, what that would mean. The court proceedings would not be over for him.
Right, exactly.
There could be potential appeals.
I mean, look,
parole.
For example, Thomas Creech.
Right.
He's been on death row for decades. He's had years and years of appeals at various levels, even a failed execution. Yeah. These things do not happen overnight, right? And at this moment, Idaho is still working out its new method of execution, the firing squad. And so, you know, we do have the death penalty, and it is something that prosecutors can pursue if they choose to, but it's, you know, likely Thomas Creech may not be sentenced to death again may not face the death penalty again in his lifetime. He may die in prison before this happens. You know, we have several other people who are on death row who've been on death row for decades as well. So, you know, ultimately, these appeals processes do drag family members back into the process. You know, they may be getting notifications that they need to testify in court. Again, as I mentioned, in addition to what could be a really gruesome and cumbersome 3 months of the jury trial, and that just being the evidentiary piece of it, and then the sentencing phase and whatnot. So I do have a copy of that plea deal in front of me, written by the Latah County Prosecutor's Office. And so this is what the agreement lines out. It said the defendant will enter guilty pleas to all those counts: burglary, because he entered the home at 1122 King Road, and then the 4 murder charges. So, you know, Xana, Ethan, Maddie, and Kaylee. He'll be sentenced to 10 years fixed for the burglary charge, and then to life in prison without the chance of parole for each of the murder counts. So that's fixed consecutive life sentences.
Gotcha.
The state can seek restitution orders about funeral expenses and victim compensation. And then, you know, him understanding that he's doing this, you know, he's not being coerced into doing this. He understands everything that he's admitting to. His attorneys have given him ample opportunity and explanation. And then I think him acknowledging he's satisfied with legal representation. And then I think the biggest thing here is defendant understands if it were to proceed to trial, he would have a right to appeal, including but not limited to issues decided by the court prior to his guilty plea, the judgment itself, the sentence. And then if it proceeded to trial, he'd have a right to file a motion under Idaho Criminal Rule 35 seeking a reduction of the sentence. So therefore, he and his team are not allowed to ask for a lesser sentence at this phase. So life in prison without parole, no ability to appeal, and they can't ask for a lesser sentence.
And again, consecutive life sentences.
Exactly.
People might ask, well, why would you do that? A life sentence is a life sentence. What would be the reasons for that? Maybe some evidence or something like that might get one of these convictions thrown out, and they're like, well, you still got these others.
Yeah, potentially. I'm not really certain on that. I do want to ask the attorneys once they're lifted from that gag order
Right.
why this is something they pursue. I do think it just assures that individual stays in prison for life. You don't want to lump all of these victims into one crime and one punishment, right? They are all individual victims, each of them murdered in this brutal way. And so they, each of those crimes deserves that punishment.
A great point there. So we've been through the details of the plea deal. We talked a little bit that you were surprised by this. Neither you and I are a district judge, or lawyers. Why do you think Kohberger would agree to this when, for the past couple of years, he seemed to have been resolved to maintain his innocence in a number of ways?
Yeah.
You talked about, say, oh, I have this alibi, somebody else did this, somebody else was involved, and then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, I did it.
Yeah. I think that's exactly it, right? His defense, there was a conversation there that we're not privy to, right? Attorney-client privilege and again, that non-dissemination order. There was a conversation there where they had realized they had exhausted all avenues. And it's interesting, had this gone to jury trial, we have to remember that in the state of Idaho, it has to be unanimous that this individual is guilty. And so from the prosecution side of it, I know you asked about Kohberger, but, just touching on the prosecution side of it,
please. It
could be likely that, one juror says, I didn't like the way that evidence was collected, or maybe I don't trust that evidence. Granted, he's got DNA against him. He had a lot of forensic evidence against him, digital forensic evidence against him. So I think from the prosecution side, that always that potential of a mistrial could occur because there's been so much exposure to this case already. And then from the defense side, like I said, they exhausted all avenues with the alternate perpetrator theory and that recent ruling against them. The asked to get the death penalty off the table, which was struck down, and then the ability to introduce that alibi. I was driving around at night looking at the stars. It just didn't. It didn't fly as an alibi.
And the prosecutor seemingly had the opportunity to get not a death sentence, which would be certainly the harshest punishment, but seemingly sort of one step down from that.
Right.
Guaranteed. Yeah. Life sentence, consecutive, no chance for appeal or parole. Again, about as serious as it gets.
Yeah.
And they could just sort of end this for all the families.
Exactly. End it for all the families. And like we said, the families don't all agree on this. They're not a monolith. Every parent has their own opinion. Every sibling has their own opinion. But from what I've gathered, the majority of the families are on board with this plea deal. And, the prosecutors did reach out to them to inform them that they were doing this before they officially offered it up. But it really happened in the span of like 48 hours. It was so quick, over really a weekend. Quick. Yeah. So, at the end of the day, you've got this jury that they sent 10,000 juror questionnaires. I received one. I know several other people. Yes, I received.
I'm guessing you didn't have a great chance to be selected.
Doubt it.
Yeah.
I do know a little too much. However, journalists can be neutral. So that's a bonus. But they cast a super wide net, but that Amazon documentary just came out, which I've heard great things about. This book just came out that's really powerful. And so I think with all of this media exposure, they knew they were going to be able to seat a jury, but it was just a matter of like, how much exposure do people have? And that was a concern for prosecutors. That was talked about. It was a concern for the judge. It was a concern overall for every party involved in this case. And so they didn't have to deal with that. They didn't have to deal with putting the families through this. And I think for the public, and I know for the Gonsalves family, for example, they aren't happy. A lot of members in the public and the Gonsalveses are not happy about this plea deal because they want to know why. And I think at the end of the day, how do you make sense of something that is so senseless? How we as human beings want to understand, right? That's our fascination with true crime. But are we really going to get a motive and an answer as to why and who we might understand who he targeted, and that's unfortunate that might not come out in public records now that it's not coming out in the trial. We all want to know. But at the end of the day, these 4 people lost their lives, and that's not going to bring them back.
Right. Bryan Kohberger, honestly, might not even know.
I know.
If there's some level of mental illness there. There's been national attention on these murders, so many questions. As this is posting now on Thursday, there's going to be hearing on possibly lifting the gag order.
Yeah.
So as you're watching this, if it is later on Thursday or later than Thursday, check ktvb.com. But I guess for people watching this in the morning, what are the chances of that getting lifted, and how much more is that going to reveal, that information?
Yeah, I mean, the non-dissemination order covers all attorneys involved in the case and then agents of those attorneys, so like law enforcement who's been involved in the case either previously or presently, defense attorneys, of course, and that's been challenging, right? When we've had questions about specific things, you asked about these consecutive life sentences, for example, or why this plea deal was made, and at what point did they decide to do this, and how did the conversation, we can't get any of those questions answered because the prosecution and the defense are under a gag order. Law enforcement is under a gag order. So they have not been allowed to talk. And, you know, this was put in place because from a very, very early stage, this was a very high profile case with a lot of national media attention on it. You know, the Layton County Clerk's office is tiny. The sheriff's office is tiny. The police department in Moscow, tiny, getting inundated with questions. And I think there was some misinformation. There was a lot of misinformation early on, and there was some conflicting information even being given by official sources. I can recall a time that happened with me, with somebody that I spoke to at the prosecutor's office giving me information they maybe shouldn't have. And so when that non-dissemination order was put on, it protected all of the information and the evidence that prosecutors were going to present in this case.
Well, speaking of those folks, for a lot of folks, the concern has really on this case been over the effect on the families. We're going to hear from one family next, right here on this Just In. Welcome back to this Just In. We're going to be joined again by main anchor and investigative reporter Morgan Romero. In just a moment, we're hearing from the parents of Ethan Chapin, who, along with Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, and Xana Kernodle, killed by Bryan Kohberger in November of 2022. Kohberger just pleaded guilty a couple weeks ago. Ethan's parents speaking out for the first time since that plea deal, and in conjunction with a Prime Video docuseries. We're going to hear from them and then talk more about all the family's reaction with Morgan on the other side.
More than 2 years after the murder of their son Ethan, Stacy and Jim Chapin tell us in an exclusive interview they finally have closure.
When you heard that this plea deal was going to go through, what was your reaction?
If I could physically do a handstand at that time, I'd probably do one, because I am so ready for it to be done.
Ethan Chapin, along with his girlfriend Xana Kernodle and her housemates Kaylee Gonsalves and Madison Mogen, all University of Idaho students, were brutally stabbed to death in November 2022 by Bryan Kohberger. Earlier this month, the former criminology student pled guilty to the murders in a plea deal that took the death penalty off the table. He's now expected to spend life in prison without parole.
I think our initial response was like an eye for an eye. But then we've spent a ton of time talking about it with prosecutors. And for us, we always felt like this was a better deal. I mean, he gets put away and there's no appeal system to it. And there were so many kids, including our own, that had been subpoenaed that no longer have this hanging over their heads. I mean, we just all get to go live our life.
There are some family members who feel like this plea deal now means that Bryan Kohberger won't face the highest form of punishment.
Everybody's entitled to grieve and feel how they want. Yeah, it's just not how we feel.
He's going to get what's coming to him. I really don't care what happens to the guy. He's off the streets and he can't hurt any more kids.
And that's the most important
That's
thing.
the most important thing.
At the plea hearing, the Chapins saw their son's killer in person for the first time.
It was cold and calculated and weirdly like an automated phone message.
Yes.
I mean, it was just like, you expected some, I don't know,
There's just nothing.
remorse, emotion, something, and there was zero.
Did you kill and murder Ethan Chapin, a human being?
Yes.
Did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, with premeditation and malice aforethought?
Yes.
When they have to read through the charges, it was like, oh, here we go. I had to take a little, that one was tough.
That's tough to listen to.
Yeah.
That.
Ethan's family says their focus now is honoring the amazing person that he was. His parents, and for the first time, his triplet siblings, Maisie and Hunter, sharing their story in a new Prime Video documentary about the murders.
I was so scared to go to bed. It was just silence. Because such a big member of our family just wasn't there anymore.
What do you hope people take away from the documentary?
What great kids they were.
Yeah.
We made a decision as a family that we would tell our version of Ethan's story one time. He was an amazing kid, and it's reflected in that.
The Chapins also started a foundation, Ethan's Smile, to spread his joy, so far providing more than $100,000 in scholarships to nearly 90 students. The family finding ways to feel Ethan's presence
We put Ethan's ashes into it.
and make sure he's never forgotten.
We all went and got tattoos. This was him, a note he wrote, like, I don't know, he probably was in the 4th grade.
Every morning, they talk to him.
You tell him what's going on in life.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's
Missed. I miss you, dude.
Yeah.
But that's how
Peggy.
I start my day every day.
Big and small ways to honor Ethan's memory.
I have him where I need him, in my mind, in my heart, in my soul.
What do you think when you hear Ethan's parents talk about that they do have some sort of closure?
Yeah, I think that's so fair. And to their point, everybody grieves differently.
Yeah.
You know, as I mentioned, not all, you know, the families aren't a monolith. Like, everybody has a different opinion of what they wanted to see happen to Bryan Kohberger. And I think for them, they also talked about how for the kids involved, for the roommates,
Right.
for the people who called 911, anybody who knew or could have been called as a witness, that would have been really, really hard for them.
Almost a re-traumatizing.
Absolutely.
Really, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, they're so graceful, they're so tactful. And so to hear them speak like that, that's their opinion, that's their perspective. And some of the family members I've talked to of the other victims agree. You know, not all the families, not all the parents are still together, and they have different viewpoints on what happened, and what they would have liked to see happen if there was a jury trial, et cetera. But I do think that for the most part, other than the Gonsalves family and maybe one other parent, most of the families are on board with this plea deal because, again, they don't have to go through this process.
And the key parts of that are no appeals, no parole hearings. They just put him in a hole and they can forget about him.
Exactly.
But we did hear from Steve Gonsalves
Yeah.
while the plea hearing was happening. He was not happy at all.
No.
He wanted to know more details, wanted to know that motive, the why even, which maybe nobody knows. Maybe no one will ever know. I can absolutely also... I don't understand what anyone is going through here, but can understand why he would want those questions answered.
Yes.
Is he going to get any answers during this sentencing next week?
That's a good question. You know, from my understanding, what will happen at the sentencing is the prosecution will speak to the judge about why they recommend this life in prison sentence. They already got the plea deal done,
Right.
So now this is the sentencing phase. I'm not sure that that's going to be part of their statements, but that, I imagine, is where they would hear that. You know, the recitation of facts that Bill Thompson, the Latah County prosecutor, gave during the plea deal, for those of you who didn't watch it, I would watch it. I'd recommend watching it. He gets he tears up, he gets choked up. I expected to maybe hear a little bit more about the motive, the why in
Right.
that context. I don't know that we're going to get that in sentencing. But Bill did say, I don't believe that Kohberger went into this intending to kill all the victims that he killed. So that kind of gives you some insight into his, you know, was he going after one of the roommates, and then the other ones were there and he took their lives as well. And so in regards to what we're going to hear at sentencing, I know we're going to hear from the prosecution, we're going to hear from the defense also telling the judge why they believe that this sentencing recommendation is appropriate for Kohberger, and we hear from victims, from family members of the victims, and they're able to give their impact statements. Kohberger also has an opportunity to give something called an allocution, and that's a statement where he can express remorse. We haven't heard him express any remorse so far, to the Chapin's point.
No.
Just very non-emotive and just yes to the crimes. So that's his opportunity, if he has any, to express remorse. It's also his opportunity to explain his life circumstances, you know, his activities, why he did what he did, and then the judge will hand down his sentence. It's a non-binding plea agreement, so Judge Hippler could theoretically hand down a lesser sentence. As I mentioned, the defense can't ask for that, but Hippler could hand down a lesser sentence. I don't expect him to do that.
No, again, I'm not a legal expert by you, but I don't think anyone is expecting that. So we talked about this being Kohberger, a chance for him to talk, to speak.
Yeah.
Do you expect that to happen?
That's such a good question. I mean, the attorneys I talk to, said sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. You know, when we go back to like his trial, if we were preparing for a 3 to 4 month long trial, there's an opportunity for a defendant to take the stand and to testify on their own behalf. It's really up to the defendant after conversations with their attorneys. And I think that could be the same thing here. I don't know, JustIN. I just haven't seen him. He's maintained his innocence up until this point. He didn't seem remorseful in any of the hearings I've attended, sitting directly behind him. Certainly didn't during this plea deal, but he could surprise us. We never know. You know, we never know. I think going back to like the why and the details about why he did what he did, there are a lot of records that are under seal right now that we are actively working on filing public records requests for. So I hope that once this is completed, that we will be able to obtain some of those records, you know, because the investigation's done, right? So like initial interviews that Kohberger had with police in Pennsylvania when he was arrested, police in Moscow, did he ever tell them why he did what he did? So public records requests could certainly shed light on that.
All righty, Morgan, thank you so much. We're going to wrap up our look ahead to Bryan Kohberger's sentencing next here on This Just In. We're back with main anchor and investigative reporter Morgan Romero. We're talking about Bryan Kohberger's sentencing coming up July 23rd. Morgan, we talked about that the families are going to give their victim impact statements during the sentencing, going to be very emotional and powerful. What do you expect them to say?
Yeah, I mean, how this horrific crime has affected them and changed their lives forever.
Yeah.
And everybody around them. You know,
and they'll be able to look Bryan Kohberger right in the eye, and that's going to be tough. Maybe some people might be looking forward to it, but I can't even imagine that, looking right in the eye of the guy who has admitted to killing your child and telling them what that's done to them.
It's emotional to think about, JustIN. I mean, you get one opportunity as a victim to do this, and this is it for them. I do know the Chapins told NBC News that they are not going to come down to Boise for the sentencing, so they won't be there. I have reached out to the other family members and have gotten in contact with Madison Mogen's mom and stepdad. They are going to be in Boise. They are going to read a victim impact statement. Xana Kernodle's mom told me that she's going to be here. She's going to read a victim impact statement as well. I don't know how many others, but my understanding is it's direct family members, so like parents and siblings. And those can be as long as they want them to be in Idaho. And people also don't have to read them aloud in court. They can send them to the judge, and the judge can have those on file. They can also have somebody else read them on their behalf, like an attorney or another family member. You know, I imagine the Chapins will be sending theirs in because they want theirs, you know, on the record. But they're really just going to share with the judge. This happens before he hands down his sentence. So, like, how has this impacted them? They have that opportunity to talk not only to Kohberger for the first time and tell him how this impacted their lives, what this loss means to them, but also to tell the judge just how much hurt this did.
You cover a lot of terrible, disturbing, awful, grisly crimes. After the sentencing, do you think the families and also even the community of Moscow, to a lesser degree, really the state of Idaho, do you think people can move on after this?
I think so. I think people are ready. I think the families are ready. You know, of course, we go back to the Gonsalves family. They wanted a trial. They wanted justice in that form of the death penalty if he was convicted. They wanted to know the details. I think it might be trickier for them, right? But I think for others, they are ready to move on. We sent Abby Walt up to Moscow when that plea deal was announced, and a lot of people she talked to were saying this is healthy for our community to be able to move past this. This is healthy for the entire U of I Vandal alumni and student, you know, family to be able to move past this. And so I do think so. You know, obviously there's a lot of media around this still, and there's a ton of media interest. As I mentioned, that documentary just dropped, a book just dropped. There's always going to be fascination with this case, but I think for the people who it impacted most, I do think that this is going to provide some closure, some healing, justice, right? If he gets these consecutive life sentences and an ability to move on. And I also want to point out too, one thing we didn't talk about, JustIN, I spoke with some experts who said they do believe he's going to be in solitary confinement, which is interesting. He's obviously going to be at the maximum security institution in Boise under the Department of Correction custody, and they believe that he'll be in solitary confinement because, you know, he's been diagnosed with autism, and he's socially maladjusted. He doesn't do well in group settings. He doesn't do well in social situations.
Morgan, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. If you have comments or questions, send them to 208-321-5614, #JustIN. We might talk about it on the show. See you next time on This Just In on KTVB.